Welcome to the extended version of this lesson on character arcs. We just covered what character arcs are, the three main types, and a trick to make your arcs more powerful. Now we're going to cover more types of arcs, a great way to start your arc off right, and cover an in-depth example from 2006's The Devil Wears Prada. Let's start with more types of arcs. We covered positive, negative, and flat arcs already, but are there more? The answer is yes. Change is complicated, and there are more than three ways to change. Another complexity is that change can't always be described as strictly positive or strictly negative. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. So let's cover two other popular arcs, as well as a whole different way of thinking about them. To start, one arc pointed out by structuralists is called the disillusionment arc. This arc shows the protag starting off with a want and setting a goal, but by the end they come disillusioned with their want, their goal, or their environment. The most popular example is The Silence of the Lambs. Clarice's want is protecting the innocent, and her goal is catching Buffalo Bill and saving Catherine. However, by the end of the story, Clarice becomes disillusioned with her want and with the FBI, as she notices that in order to catch Buffalo Bill, Hannibal Lecter was released. Yes, she achieved her goal and her want, but was it worth it since Lecter is now on the loose? So Clarice's psychology changes to a strange feeling of disillusionment, somewhere between positive and negative. Another common arc is the corruption arc. This arc shows a protag who has already embraced a need, fall victim to a flaw, and embrace it instead. As opposed to a negative arc, where a protag starts with a flaw and rejects the need, going from bad to worse, the corruption arc actually shows the protag changing from good to bad. The most popular example of this is in The Godfather, where Michael starts off rejecting the corruption of his family, but ends up embracing it by the end. As you can see in this example, the protag usually feels good, or at least neutral about their decision, but the audience can clearly see they have turned from a hero into a monster. Finally, there's a whole other way to look at character arcs. It's from John Truby's The Anatomy of Story, and instead of thinking about them in terms of positive or negative, Truby thinks about them as a shift of the protag's role. For example, instead of corruption arc, Truby says leader to tyrant. Instead of a positive arc, he describes the three arcs he calls child to adult, adult to leader, and leader to visionary. We won't dive into this concept, but it illustrates there are different ways to think about character arcs. At the end of the day, embrace whatever is most useful to you as a writer. Now, let's look at a strategy to ensure your character arc is clear enough for the audience to understand. One common problem with stories is when the audience doesn't notice the change in the protag, and this is often because they aren't shown the protag's flaw in a clear way. If the audience can't see how the protag's flaw is holding them back, how will they understand the importance of the need? So here's a tip. Make sure you show how your protag's flaw is affecting them at the beginning of your story. In fact, make a whole scene about it. This is sometimes called an illustrating event and is used to help your audience understand where your protag is starting from. This way, when they have their epiphany and embrace their need, your audience can compare the end of story protag with the start of story protag and understand the massive change they've undergone. Finally, let's see character arcs in action with our in-depth example.
The Devil Wears Prada is a 2006 dramedy that follows Andy, a hopeful writer, as she takes an assistant job to ruthless fashion magazine editor-in-chief Miranda Priestley. We've chosen this story to explore character arcs as it has a more uncommon arc than normal, which could be described as a flat arc. In this movie, protag Andy starts off with an embraced need, falters as she lets a flaw consume her, but rediscovers her need at the end of the story. You can also find this arc in Mean Girls or Sierra Burgess is a Loser. Let's start at the beginning of the story. Andy is a hopeful writer looking for journalism work. It's clear she wants to do something meaningful, and we later learn she turned down admission to law school to become a writer. It's clear Andy has already embraced the need of humanity, which you could also call integrity, as she wants to help others. This is double highlighted by her piece on the janitors union, which, I mean, come on, how much more helping others can you get? So she starts in a positive state. Then Andy gets a job at Runway, a fashion magazine, as an assistant to the ruthless editor-in-chief, Miranda. Miranda is the very opposite of humanity, treating her staff horribly and acting apathetically about it. This is hinted at in the movie, but Andy will soon metaphorically sell her soul to the devil for fashion success, and the future of that road is exemplified by Miranda. About a third of the way into the movie, Andy realizes that in order to succeed at Runway, she will have to become more subservient and less independent. In this way, she is starting to embrace her flaw of soullessness, which is fitting for the selling your soul to the devil metaphor underlying the movie. Notice this humanity versus soullessness metaphor is also highlighted by Andy's choice between becoming a journalist and a lawyer, two professions often defined by their humanity or soullessness. So Andy begins to embrace her flaw, and we see it wreak havoc on her life. As she becomes more apathetic and soulless, she pushes away her boyfriend, stabs her coworker in the back, and loses her best friend. Even Nigel, the mentor character, points out how the soullessness required for professional success is bound to not only ruin your personal life, but also send your whole life up in smoke. We can see Andy's arc is now heading downhill fast. Then Andy goes to Paris Fashion Week with Miranda. She discovers Miranda is getting a divorce, but completely quells her feelings and focuses on work. Andy has a moment when she looks in a mirror, remembering her old life, where she glimpses her epiphany, that this ruthlessness is not healthy, that her soul is more important than success. Unfortunately, she's still tied to Miranda and tries to save her from being ousted from the company. But Miranda is 2 steps ahead and already blackmailed the magazine's chairman to keep herself as editor-in-chief. Which leads to the real moment of epiphany when Andy is riding in the car with Miranda. Miranda says that she and Andy are alike, which Andy disagrees with. But Miranda highlights that Andy acted soullessly when she stabbed her coworker in the back. And when Andy says she didn't have a choice, Miranda reminds her that of course she had a choice. But she chose her flaw of soullessness over her need of humanity. So Andy has her epiphany and re-embraces her need. She abandons Miranda, throws away the cell phone she has been chained to, apologizes to her boyfriend, and gets a job at a newspaper. When she sees Miranda on the street, we see Andy is back to her original need-filled self, and waves. This scene beautifully contrasts the soullessness represented by Miranda and the humanity represented by Andy. And with Andy now back to the positive, it's also why this movie is such a perfect example of a character arc.
Hopefully this example gives you a stronger understanding of how character arcs can help visualize the protag's change, which also helps visualize the B story. This also brings us to the end of this mini course on storytelling. As you continue, keep these lessons in mind of why we tell stories, how stories have both internal and external elements, and how using tools like character arcs can help us visualize them. We'll see you in the next course.